Since the beginning of One Punch Man, Blast has been one of the most mysterious and interesting characters in the story. And with the most recent chapters, although we've seen way more of Blast than we ever have, his origins and motivations are still surrounded by a ton of question marks, until today. Yeah, that's right. I actually think One and Murata have subtly given us enough information on Blast at this point for us to be able to fill in the gaps ourselves, and that's exactly what I'll be doing in this video. This is Anime Anxiety, and by the end of this video, you'll have an understanding of just how interesting and tragic Blast's story really is. So let's get into it. To best understand Blast's beginnings, I'll actually be starting from the most recent chapters that we see him in and work my way back to when we first see him do anything of note in chapter 139, because this part is actually the most important, believe it or not, and needs some context around it to give you a better idea of the bigger picture. So in chapter 167, we see Blast teleporting Saitama and Garou just outside of Earth in an attempt to save the planet from the destructive force of two serious punches colliding. He then realizes that they're still too close to Earth but is unable to move them further. This is when we meet his team for the first time canonically. Three silhouetted figures appear behind Blast and assist him with deflecting the shockwave and save the Earth from certain doom. We actually see them in more detail in 164, but the chapter was later redrawn and reduced them to silhouettes that are based in an undisclosed location where they are able to observe Earth and watch over the dimensional seal that's keeping God imprisoned. Before meeting his team in 167, we finally got a taste of Blast's strength and abilities in his brief fight with Garou in 166. In this fight, we see his gravity bending power set with his gravity knuckle and dimensional blast and hyperspace gate powers. Although it's the first time we see him use gravity attacks, we actually see him use hyperspace gates when he teleports Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Minako to the surface from underground. This is after they find a mysterious cube underground that then creates this cosmic link that allows God to communicate with them and creates this pocket dimension where time is slowed down considerably in the process. Blast was somehow aware that this happened and intervened before anyone can make a deal with God. It's not to say that they would have made a deal with him in the first place, but that was his purpose for going there. In hindsight, he probably sensed this from his undisclosed dimensional space where he watches over Earth with the rest of his team. A similar encounter between God and Blast happens immediately after they're all taken to the surface, when God attempts to grant power to Tatsumaki while posing as Blast. She notices that it's in fact not Blast, which keeps God from making contact with her just before the real Blast shows up and acknowledges how much she's grown since they last met. There are a few things we can assume from Blast's actions in all of these sequences. The first being that Blast is aware of the fact that God grants humans power, and God is aware of Blast's existence based on his extreme reaction to him appearing and addresses him by name. This means that they have some kind of history. We can also assume that Blast must have some kind of Esper abilities, as he's able to sense God's presence without touching a cube, and he can also sense Tatsumaki's resistance to God's influence. It's interesting to note that Tatsumaki is also able to communicate with God without touching a cube, which leads me to believe that Espers have an inherent ability of being able to communicate with God. We also have to note that God was aware of Tatsumaki and Blast's relationship, since Blast's appearance was the one that he chose to take on to try and fool her. This means that he was aware of their first encounter 18 years prior when Blast saved Tatsumaki from the research facility in her flashback. And speaking of this flashback, this is when we really get into the crazy implications of Blast's involvement in all of this God stuff. In Tatsumaki's flashback, we see her imprisoned in this cube-shaped research facility when suddenly a hybrid monster goes on a rampage, causing everyone to flee and leaving Tatsumaki behind, as they deem her not useful for their purposes. She awaits her death when she is suddenly saved by Blast. Blast questions why she didn't try and stop the monster, to which Tatsumaki says that her powers don't work. Blast then somehow knows that she's lying and assumes she's been hiding her power to give the impression that she's useless to the researchers of that facility. He then notes that there's someone out there that needs her protection and is somehow aware that Tatsumaki has a sister just by touching her on the head, and is even aware of her appearance. This can also be attributed to his Esper powers. This interaction tells us a lot about Blast. He somehow knew where the research facility was, and he knew that they were in possession of a cube. At face value, this doesn't seem like much, but it's an extremely important piece of info that shows us the bigger picture and is where I'll begin to tie everything together. I believe that Blast knew about the facility because he had been there before as a prisoner, just like Tatsumaki. That sounds crazy, but it makes sense when you take into account the purpose of the research facility. We don't get any direct information about the purpose of it, but seeing as how they're in a facility that holds a number of espers along with the cube, and it seems that the facility also creates these hybrid monsters, it's possible that they use espers to unlock the powers of the cube, which then allows them to access God's power and buffs up regular monsters to create powerful hybrids, much like how God grants power to humans to make them stronger. This means that Blast could have been imprisoned at this facility to serve this purpose. Sometime in the past, he was introduced to the cube during an experiment, and his Esper powers allowed him to communicate with God. It was then that Blast received his cosmic powers from him, as God saw great potential in him as a potential vessel. However, Blast's Esper powers allowed him to break God's control over him and use his newfound dimension-shifting powers to teleport himself out of the facility. He now also has the ability to identify where other cubes are, as they're all linked to God like he is. He can now sense cubes and other beings that are influenced by God, as God's cosmic powers seem to be interlinked. Now having knowledge of God and his intentions, Blast dedicated his life to collecting the cubes and thwarting God's plans of resurrecting himself. Along the way, he encountered current members of his team who share the same goal of keeping God sealed away. He then spends most of his time collecting cubes and fighting the beings that are created by God's influence, and eventually makes his way back to the research facility where he knew another cube was kept. This explains why he went there in the first place. This is when he meets Tatsumaki. Much later, while looking over the dimensional seal keeping God dormant, he senses an interaction with one of the cubes and goes to Earth to investigate. This is when he meets Saitama, Flashy Flash, and Monako and takes the cube from them before taking them back to the surface. Once on the surface, he senses yet another interaction with God, which is when he intervenes in God's plan to trick Tatsumaki. Once he realizes that she's safe, he returns to the undisclosed dimension where he and his team are based out of. He then notices that the dimensional seal is breaking due to Garou's massive attack, where he causes a portion of the planet to bulge out. They immediately spring into action, but the weakening of the seal allows God to influence Garou. Blast senses this and quickly tries to intervene. This is when we see Blast and Garou's fight, and when we see him attempt to diverge the force of Saitama and Garou's serious punches to save the Earth with the help of his team. We can assume that once this fight between Garou and Saitama is over, in possibly later arcs, we'll get some more in-depth information on Blast's relationship with God and some details of what he's been up to in all this time. But until then, I think we nailed it already. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think that Blast was kept in this facility like Tatsumaki was, and this is kind of like the origin of Blast, the way I kind of laid this out? Or do you think I'm totally crazy and think it's something completely different? Either opinion is valid, so I want to hear it in the comments. I want to hear what you guys have to say. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and please subscribe, as I post a ton of One Punch Man content weekly, so you'll never get any shortage of it here. But until next time, I'll see you guys later.